If you find yourself getting bogged down in perfect exercises or the methods people use, or really a lot of the FOMO, fear of missing out type of content in the strength and conditioning and rehab world, then I hope this relatively short presentation helps you just start to look at the overarching principles, not even all of the overarching principles, but the ones that I think really help me start to understand what training is about and how to help people achieve their goals. So again, hopefully this should start to help you create some architecture in your mind to then make programming and coaching decisions based off of. First and foremost, let's define what training is. Training is the practice of creating change on purpose. Exercise, in contrast, is general activity with the goal of just general benefit to us as an individual, making us healthier, right? If you want to just get healthier, a lot of things are going to work, and that's totally fine. When we train, we are looking to create more specific, goal-oriented adaptations. Training for health is not a bad goal, it's just often relatively nebulous. A lot of people create relatively nebulous goals and then they kind of spin their wheels when they could just frankly be doing good general activity and good training towards, running faster, getting stronger, and being okay with a more general overarching process. A lot of the fitness industry has become like making people feel like there's a perfect pathway to things, when in reality, we just have to clarify where we want to actually go and then consistently move in that direction and make little tweaks along the way. If you've never heard the story of the Cheshire Cat and Alice in Wonderland, basically Alice goes up to the cat and she says, "Would you tell me please which way I had to go from here?" And the cat says, "That depends on where you want to go." And Alice notes, "I don't much care where." And the cat replies, "It doesn't really matter which way you go, so long as I get somewhere." Alice added as an explanation, "Oh, sure, to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough," right? So, to some extent, if Alice just keeps walking, she's going to get somewhere. Is it where she wants to go? Without her clarifying that, she's never really going to know, right? So we want to orient training around what people's goals are, and we want to get more and more specific over time, but it really boils down to training being about achieving some desirable outcome that we have created a more structured process around. Whereas general activity and exercise generally benefits us and is good, but it's not necessarily going to drive specific adaptations, which we'll talk more about here coming up. So I typically think about stress as the primary thing to think about as the foundation of training, and understanding stress well enough can help us create better programs that allow people to adapt and recover and get the benefits they want, right? Physiologic stress is defined as the body's response to physical stressors such as injury, illness, or exercise, potentially excessive. There are mechanisms that basically take in the fact that we are being challenged, and then we have a cascade of nervous system and hormonal effects that ultimately either prepare us for a continued stressor or help us recover and adapt to that previous one. A really simple model to start to incorporate is just thinking about the total stress that someone is under and using that as part of the guiding of the training process, right? So internal and external load simply means that there are things happening inside the body that we would consider like stressful, like the perception of effort and the challenge, also the prior amount of fatigue that is potentially built up. There's also just the external variables of training, like the weights, the reps, the set. We need to manage both of those things. We also need to take into consideration that there are often cognitive stress or just life getting inside of our head and ultimately having effects on our body. People often get hurt in periods of time where their cognitive stress is very high in conjunction with physical stressors. There's also just people have illnesses or systemic issues like chronic diseases or high blood pressure or other internal stressors that are a product of stress to some extent, that we need to manage, right? We want to try to find sort of this optimal range, and it's really tricky to think that there's a set optimal range for people, but we don't want to overload them too much because things typically break down when we do that, and there's all sorts of systemic effects. But if we underload people, the same thing generally occurs. We're not actually helping them improve their physiology and improve their performance. The fitness fatigue model is basically the two-factor model of training. Basically, whenever you do a workout, it's going to provide some amount of positive adaptation if it was sufficiently stimulating enough. Basically, think of this as like your short-term potentiation. It's going to improve maybe your ability to, let's say, throw a ball hard or do a squat well. Eventually, these bouts of short-term potentiation start to compound. Your body recognizes these repeated stressors, and then you become more likely to adapt and be able to do something like a performance better, right? But you're also going to have fatigue, which is almost a little bit paradoxically that you're going to get tired. That will reduce your performance. So we have like this benefit, but there's also a fatigue that accumulates, right? And those two things intersect. And depending on how much fitness was gained, how much fatigue was accumulated, you get some amount of performance. What we want to do, and what our body actually does, hopefully over time, is get better at things not having so much of a robust fatigue-oriented response so that we can improve performance over time. There's a lot of factors in this, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds because I could potentially do that, and I don't necessarily know if I need to or if I really want to because I don't know if I totally understand it all the time. But there are essentially peripheral and central fatigue alongside of the muscular damage that occurs from doing a workout, doing something strenuous. Basically, we have our peripheral nervous system starts to accumulate factors that make it less likely that you're going to perform well, and inside of our central nervous system, there are factors that let us know that we're fatigued, that we should be mindful. Again, it's not as simple as like that we've turned the dial and we're perfectly set that this you shouldn't do X, Y, Z. A lot of times these are also clouded by our thoughts, beliefs, and expectations. Specificity and the general adaptation syndrome are kind of weirdly two coins to the same side. Basically, the said principle, specific adaptation to impose demands, is that you get better at what you practice. When you do a squat, you get better at squatting. When you do a sprint, you get better at sprinting. When you do a movement, you get better at it, right? But then alongside that, there are general adaptations that come from physical performance. And you can see this when people just start exercising if they haven't been exercising. Like, they might not ever do a deadlift, but in the first 6 to 8 weeks, their physical general strength comes up. I've actually seen this with clients that really don't have regular access to a barbell, and will do a deadlift as like a test exercise on their first day of training, and then we'll test it again 4 and 8 weeks later when they come back and see me and we overhaul their programming or something like that, and they have gotten stronger at the deadlifts without actually doing deadlifts, right? Now, they also have gotten stronger at lunging and squatting and doing like the movements they've done a little bit more specifically, but there's this basic repetitive bout effect that occurs that you become a more physically capable human being over time when you train well. Now, there's diminishing returns in that as well. If you don't practice something and you're trying to achieve a high level of skill, you're probably not going to achieve that high level of skill. And there's a capacity and a skill component, which I'll get into here shortly. So, foundational to training is the desire to progress, right? When we try to progress, we basically are trying to be able to handle more and more challenge. Now, a lot of times we should actually flip the general idea that to get better, we have to make things harder, and instead allow ourselves to get better so that then we need to make things harder. It's the notion of progressive overload flipped a little bit on its head. Most of the time people think, oh, to get stronger, I need to add more weight. And that might be true to some extent. But more so is what we should be trying to do is sneak in the extra load or the extra challenge after we have adapted. So this might look like staying at the same weight for a few weeks, allowing our body to adapt, and then increasing load as opposed to adding weight from week to week, right? Both can work, but it's more clear that someone has adapted when they basically can subjectively and objectively do something at the same level of challenge that they did before. We want to gradually increase the stress as someone feels ready for it. Again, this is where most people just add on stress without being ready for it. And there's no perfect way to do this at this current juncture, but if your performance is increasing, it probably means that you are doing something right. You're getting stronger, you're doing something right, and we need to just consistently add a little bit more challenge basically as you can handle it. And you need to take into account the stressors that I've already noticed or noted above, and we also just need to constantly triangulate. Are you ready for this? Is it looking good? Are we monitoring technique? We're monitoring their general sense of well-being, how their performance going. We're just monitoring things and making adjustments, right? Adaptations are specific to the stimulus. This is one of those things that you get what you train for. If you move really slow, you are not going to train yourself to move fast. If you're doing a specific muscle action, you're probably going to get specific gains in that muscle action. Now, developing a high amount of the ability to produce force can be really useful, but there is kind of like a diminishing amount of carryover between, say, doing a really heavy deadlift and because you're producing a ton of force and doing something like a sprint. It's probably good to do some deadlifts, but at a certain point, there isn't a whole lot of benefit to like necessarily maxing out your deadlift all the time and trying to squat. In real simple terms, it's probably more beneficial that you're good at sprinting, because it's a high amount of force production in a low amount of time. It probably has more carryover to deadlifting than deadlifting necessarily does, especially when you're adequately strong, to sprinting. And then we're altering variables over time for the challenging to remain, the trainings to remain challenging. Physical qualities. This is just one thing to start to think about, like, what is the person after and where are they at, right? So the things that we can actually tangibly see are muscular strength and size, the range of motion and flexibility someone can demonstrate, the endurance that they have, both aerobic and anaerobic, the power and the speed that they can demonstrate, which is basically force production in a fast period of time, and then how skilled they are and their coordination. Those kind of come in to view whether or not they're tangible. Like, we kind of think about quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative simply means like, hey, we can measure this really well. Qualitative is almost like, hey, you can tell that person is good at their sport. They're good at moving. And, you can't always see, like, the adaptations that occurred to have improved quality, but, like, it when you see it. I like to think about things from the 4-quadrant model. This is from Dan John, and essentially there's a level of preparation and a level of qualities that people just exhibit, right? Most people are in quadrant 3. They have few physical qualities and they express them at a low level. They're relatively sedentary, right? When you think about like what kids need, a lot of kids need to have a high amount of physical qualities. They have lots of the ability to like jump and play and rotate and do all sorts of things, but they're not necessarily developing them to a high level, right? Sports are a great demonstration a lot of times of high level of qualities, or a high level of the ability to perform things, and then a difference in like what you need to be good at. So if you're like a single event athlete in track, you only run the 100 meters, right? You don't need to have necessarily a ton of physical qualities per se. Like, you don't need to have a ton of muscle size. You need to probably have enough muscle size. You don't have to necessarily have the most range of motion. You definitely don't need to have the most aerobic capacity, even though it'll probably be good to have some for recovery. Whereas like a football player or a rugby player, they need to demonstrate pretty good amount of muscular size. Flexibility and mobility, maybe not the most important, but it's probably good to have. They need to have both anaerobic and aerobic endurance. And they need to have power and speed, and they need to have coordination and skill to play their sport. So we can think through the lens of these physical qualities to help us shape the training that they need to do. They might need to have more elements of like, yeah, they need to do hypertrophy training. They need to do strength and power training. They also need to train for flexibility, and they need to train for aerobic capacity. Again, it goes back to the goals. It also goes back to just where somebody is currently at in terms of capacity. When you think about individualization of training, I think a lot of people often go, it's like, well, what's the best training for that person, right? And I really think it's just simpler than that. It boils down to, what does that person want to do? What is the goal? Because their goal and maybe the priorities that they lay out, whether they're an athlete or just somebody looking to get healthy and in shape, they need to have a goal so that we can move in the direction of it. You know, if they want to run a 5K, we're going to have running, endurance-oriented running in their program. If they want to become good at powerlifting, we're going to do some form of squat, bench, and deadlift in their program. If they're looking to play a sport more like soccer, we need to tease out what qualities they need to become the best soccer player they can be, and maybe what their weaknesses are, right? So what is their capacity? What are they good at already? You know, you don't necessarily need to think about this from a training standpoint, but if we want somebody to be a good soccer player, well, we do need to think about this from a training standpoint. We need to make sure they have enough energy to practice their sport a lot. And that means not running them ragged in training all the time, right? What are they already good at? What do they need to improve? We can keep building up their strengths while also improving upon the things that their weaknesses. If they're a soccer player and they can't run maybe let's say a 6-minute and 30-second mile, is that super important? No, but it's probably a good proxy for their general aerobic endurance. Now, if they can run a really fast 40-meter dash and they're like a striker, that's going to come into play. If they're a midfielder and they don't necessarily have great endurance, but they have good touch, we can start to think about building up their endurance alongside their general soccer playing skills. For your average run-of-the-mill fitness person, like most of the time they want to get fitter, they want to lose weight, they want to feel stronger, and they want to trust their body. Okay, those are good goals. We just need to clarify what they need to do to trust their body, right? What they need to do to lose weight and build muscle. The better we can get at clarifying those things, the more we can dial in their training and the behaviors that will help their training. Dosing. There's really 3 big things to manage when it comes to dosing training well, and they are volume, intensity, and frequency. So volume is how much do we need to do to get where we want to go? How much do we need to practice, right? Intensity considerations orient around, how hard does that need to be? And frequency is how often are we going to do it? All 3 of these factors cannot be turned up to 11 all the time. You get to choose 2 a lot of times, and sometimes maybe only 1, where you keep the general. If you're going to do something very, very high frequency for the skill component, maybe you don't make it very hard, right? It does need to be challenging, so that's where you maybe need to make it a little bit more challenging. But you really want to think, which 2 of these do I want to emphasize based on the goals that we want to achieve, right? If there's a lot of people who what they do and they don't realize it is that they're actually turning all of these things relatively high for them. They're training at a high volume. They're training at a high intensity for them. And they're doing it frequency. This is like a classic example of New Year's resolution crowd. They're like, they haven't exercised and they go back into exercising 6 days a week. They're pushing their body harder than they can take in terms of intensity, and they're doing it with a high amount of volume relative to what they actually need and can handle. And this is what brings us to the minimum effective versus maximum recoverable dose, right? So what's the minimum needed to drive adaptation? A lot of times, if people are being consistent, they don't need nearly as much as they think they do, especially when we think about maintaining freshness and just the stress of everyday life. You don't need to necessarily do 5 sets of 10 all the time on your exercises when 2 might be beneficial. Now, this is an experiment, and it might mean that sometimes we do more volume. Sometimes it means we pull back on the volume after they've been doing a high period of volume to allow performance to be shown. When you kind of think back to the fitness fatigue model, think about like swimmers and distance athletes preparing for an event. They're often accumulating a ton of fatigue and continuing to train, and then before they go to perform, they pull back on that intensity and volume a little bit so that they can recover and then perform the task at a high level of skill. So we want to start to think about, okay, what's the minimum effective dose, and what is potentially this person's ceiling. A lot of times when we're rehabbing people, or when people are just trying to get good results, they really don't need to be nearly as close to maximum recoverable volume as they think, especially for long periods of time. If you want to push somebody from in a certain period of time, maybe for a week at the end of a training cycle or at the beginning of a training cycle, and then kind of taper things down, you can do that. We really want to just have basically undulating, meaning, managing these variables well so that people can push and pull back over and over again. A really good axiom, I don't remember who said this. I tried to find it. I'm sure it's some form of a Russian sport physiologist or weightlifting coach, but it's essentially train as often as you can, as fresh as you can. And this is what incorporates something that I'm going to talk about in the next slide, of just dynamic systems and constraints, right? I think it's really easy to get into like that there's this single thing or there's this perfect program, when actually there's just a lot of factors that go into somebody's behaviors and the results they get. And complex behaviors often arise from multiple components: our environment, us as an individual, and the tasks we're trying to achieve, right? There's a nice soup of things that arise from a bunch of ingredients that we are putting together, and we want to get the ingredients right, and we want to get the cooking temperature right, so that ultimately the soup that comes about is like, it tastes good and it's getting good results. And that acknowledges the fact that we need to basically build people's capacities. We need to help them do the things I mentioned above, like improving on their aerobic capacity or their physical strength or their ability to produce force. But we also need to work on the skills associated with those tasks as well. There is a skill component to performing a squat well. There's a skill component to doing an ab exercise. There's these intuitive things that people start to pick up on when they pay attention. And sometimes that means like cueing people and instructing them, but a lot of times it really boils down to create rules, create opportunities for people to get feedback on if they're successful or not, use appropriate equipment. So when I say that, it's like you're going to get a much different stimulus when you deadlift a barbell for 200 pounds compared to a kettlebell for 75. Both can be useful, but if we're trying to push somebody's top end strength up, that 200-pound deadlift is probably going to be more beneficial, and they're going to have to organize around the barbell compared to organizing around the kettlebell. We also just want to clarify goals, and that can mean in the overarching program, but it could also mean in the movement we're trying to perform. Sometimes it's just as simple as, hey, what you're trying to do on this movement is push your butt back. Don't let your knees bend, right? Or, hey, when you're squatting, try to maintain your upper back position and don't let the barbell round you forward. That's a way to clarify the goals, and then we want to create the task in a way that helps them be successful. So that could mean lightening the load. It could mean giving them a different way to think about it, or it could mean shortening the distance that they're going to do it in, or it could mean changing where the load's at. The more we create rules, use the structure of the program to elicit the behaviors and the things we want to see, the better things go over time. So hopefully this overview of the principles has just helped you see that, like, okay, there's a lot of things to take into consideration, and the better we get at looking at things through a principles-oriented lens, the better we can start to design more specific programs based on people's goals that will move them in the direction of their goals over and over again, while creating a relatively repeatable system for us to allow adaptations to come out. Right? It's not about perfect exercise or the perfect program. We want to utilize those things as tools. We want to utilize exercises and the program as tools to help us drive the adaptations that we want.